So let's look at the data. The research first examined the survival probability among first offenders relative to those drivers that did not have an offense on their driver record. And we looked at all 8 ways that you can come through the system, that is, the disposition sequence. We wanted to see how that affected first offenders in terms of their survival. Survival meaning that they were not rearrested for alcohol-impaired driving. Well, if you look at our data, we used Maryland drivers from 1994 to 1999. We excluded deceased drivers, those drivers who had left the state, who had an expired license for more than 6 months, and obviously we got rid of duplicate records. So this left us with about 23 million active driver records. We were able to obtain the segregated records, that is, those drivers who received a diversion program or PBJ. Since that is not a public record, that data is generally not available to researchers. However, we were able to obtain the segregated records in order to look at those disposition sequences. And we note in some instances, a driver that received a PBJ, we had to impute the event date. Well, we calculated a hazard ratio. A hazard ratio is beyond this particular webinar, but in general, a hazard ratio above 1 means that the risk is higher, the higher the hazard risk for the event of interest. So here, you'll note that no matter how they come through the system, whether or not it's just administrative per se and not convicted, administrative per se convicted, or any of the other disposition sequences, they all have high hazard ratios, the lowest being 49. And these are astoundingly high. So the bottom line is it doesn't matter how they come through the system or whether they're convicted or not. If they blow high at roadside under an administrative sanction, it doesn't matter if they're criminally convicted by the judicial system. It means they still have the same risk of recidivizing as those drivers that were convicted. Yet our public policy is to only look at convictions or 3 out of the 8 ways that a driver can drive alcohol impaired. Next graph shows the survival probability, and survival means surviving not being rearrested for alcohol impaired driving. It may be a little bit difficult to see, but you see across the top line under 1.00 a green line that just barely goes down. Those are drivers that had no prior alcohol impaired driving events, that is any of the 8 dispositions. But look at the survival from 1993 to 1999. No matter how they came through the system, they had a high likelihood of recidivating. In other words, it didn't matter whether or not they were criminally convicted. Any of the 8 occurrences of alcohol impaired driving led to a high risk of recidivating. I show this another way using relative risk. And relative risk is looking at the probability of having a prior, or the odds of having a prior, divided by the odds of a driver who does not have any priors, both obtaining an alcohol-impaired driving event. Relative risks above 1 mean it's a higher risk. Below 1 means that it's a safety factor. So if you look here at the 8 ways that they can come through the system, you'll see that the relative risk was above 45 for all groups, all disposition sequences. To put this in perspective, when it was first discovered the association between smoking and lung cancer, the relative risk approached about 25. And everyone is familiar that cigarettes are highly associated with a relative risk of 25. Here we have a risk above 45 for each of the ways that a person can come through the system either administratively or judicially. So it simply does not make sense to base public policy just on convictions. So what can we conclude from this? Well, One is having even one prior alcohol-related event when it gets on the driver record is substantially and significantly a high risk for that person recidivating. And it does not matter how they came through the system, whether it was handled strictly administrative, judicially, or through a diversion program. So again, having even one alcohol-related event on the driver record by itself is a high and powerful statistical risk factor of future recidivism. And I just conclude again, conviction is not the marker, even though that's what public policy is based on now. It's the alcohol-related event. Next study we wanted to look at was, does time matter? That is, does time between an alcohol-impaired driving have any effect on the risk of recidivating? The way this question was raised when we were doing our interlock research in Maryland was the Code of Maryland Administrative Regulations defined a multiple offender as 2 alcohol-related violations within 5 years or 3 lifetimes. Those drivers meeting that criteria had to submit proof of satisfactory participation in a certified alcohol treatment program before they were eligible to obtain their license again. Well, in my opinion and Tom's opinion, we felt that any 2 alcohol-related events made a driver a multiple offender. And obviously we thought that any first offender was any 1 alcohol-related event. But the state of Maryland said that in order for me to call a multiple offender any 2, I had to show them evidence that it was a problem. So we conducted the research to look at the effective time on survival without an alcohol-related traffic recidivism among first offenders. The data we used was alcohol violations occurring between 1973 and 1999, and a second alcohol-related violation between 1994 and 1999. Again, we used survival analysis and hazards ratios to investigate this issue. Among all drivers with 2 priors, those who had 2 priors within 5 years had a slightly higher rate of recidivism than those drivers who had 2 and greater than 5 years. But I note that the hazards ratio between the 2 groups was not statistically significant. So in other words, it didn't matter whether the person had 2 violations within 5 years or 2 violations lifetime, they had essentially the same risk of recidivating. Although the group that had the 2 within 5 years had a minuscule, slightly better recidivism rate. Well, that brings up the question, does the way they come through the system administratively or judicially make a difference? So we had enough data to look at 7 of the 8 ways that a person can come through the system to see if that makes a difference. And I'm not going to show you all 8, but this summarizes the 2 groups. Again, each time the line goes down, that's another person rearrested for alcohol-impaired driving. And you can see the red line is the 2 years in lifetime, and the green line is 2 violations within 5 years. There's just simply no difference between the 2 groups. And to show you just one disposition sequence, these are drivers who had 2 and 5 or 2 lifetime who were administrative per se sanctioned. That is, sanctioned at roadside administratively by either the DMV or the MVA, but were not criminally convicted. And you can see visibly the 2 groups simply did not differ in terms of their risk of recidivating. So recidivism was high in both groups depending on the disposition sequence, but it only ranged from 20 to 35% for drivers with 2 priors in less than 5 years, and 20 to 34% among drivers who had the 2 priors lifetime. And so you can see the 2 within 5 years only were 1% worse off than 2 lifetime. So again, this reevaluates whether time between violations makes a difference, and in fact it does not. 2 lifetime has the same risk of recidivating as a driver 2 within 5 years.
Again, can we ask everyone to put their phones on mute, please, so we all can hear the presentation? Thank you so much.